Hey, Star Wars fans. It's a good day to be a Star Wars fan, is it not? Right? Today is the first time in a long time that I'm genuinely excited to watch something Star Wars related, and I'll tell you why. A lot of it has to do with the fact that I've been watching Clone Wars and recently just watched The Rebels for the first time. Actually finished that for the first time today, like hours ago, and holy smokes. How did I sleep on that show for so long? What in the world? So full disclosure, I actually started to watch that one in college along with Clone Wars, and both kind of fell off. I don't know why I did. Clone Wars I caught up on when the last season came out. I got up to speed on all of that, and that was at a time where they were still releasing the not the prequels, the sequel trilogy, and I felt like maybe it was necessary to go through some of that and, I don't know, revisit characters that I grew up loving and that sort of thing. But when Mando came out and started introducing Clone Wars characters, I was like, oh man, this is getting kind of like, we're getting into the deep cuts now. And then when Boba kind of introduced Cad Bane, I was like, okay, we're really getting into the deep cuts now. And Mando Season 2 obviously introduced Ahsoka for the first time in live action, which is really, really sick. So when they announced the show, even before any of the trailers and everything, I was like, okay, I need to start watching through this. So I'm married, I have a wife and a baby, and it's a lot. So trying to get through any show is a chore these days. However, I felt like in my spare time when I could here and there, kind of go through it, that sort of thing. And it hit me last week. I was like, oh man, this show comes out soon, so I got to watch it. So I did, and I finished the show today, and oh my goodness, it's so good. I'm really glad that I don't have to wait on that cliffhanger for years. But I say all that to say, today is Ahsoka Day. We're going to be breaking everything down on the channel after every episode, and we'll be doing reviews and all that sort of stuff. I'm a huge Star Wars nut, so I think that it only makes sense for me to do that and cover it here, especially since we talk about theme parks and movies and that sort of thing. And Star Wars definitely has a theme park section in Disney, and we're going to go into that a little bit later as well. So the last kind of Star Wars thing that we got was Mandalorian Season 3 earlier this year, right? Earlier this year? And I, along with many other Star Wars fans, had not bones to pick necessarily with the show, but it left a lot to be desired, especially after Season 2 and the gap that we had to wait to get from Season 2 to Season 3. Season 3 ultimately ended up feeling very aimless and like the writers didn't really know which direction to take the characters and that sort of thing. So I don't want to get too into the weeds on all of that, but I will just let you know that it wasn't my favorite. What I have been a big fan of, though, is anything that Dave Filoni has had his hand directly involved in. That first season of Mando was pretty solid to me, while it kind of felt like adventure hopping a little bit. It was still enjoyable. The second season grounded it a little more for me, and obviously brought in Ahsoka and Luke Skywalker and characters that I just didn't expect to see in the show, which was a welcome surprise and really hit home for me, especially after the sequel trilogy that Disney did. I'll just be straight up with you guys. I'm one of the people that didn't really care for the sequels that much. I don't absolutely abhor them, but there are a lot of weird decisions made that just don't jive with me, that I don't feel like are consistent with Star Wars characters or in keeping with the canon that George originally set up, and that's okay. Those things can be debated and argued all day long, and it's neither here or there. I'm here to talk about Ahsoka today, at least a little bit about Ahsoka today. So I grew up a huge Star Wars fan. I grew up loving the prequels. I grew up loving the original trilogy. It's one of the first film franchises that I've ever watched that I really got invested in. And I think that George made it that way originally so that kids could really connect to characters and see themselves as heroes in a sense, especially in the prequels where you get to see Anakin go from boy to young Jedi Padawan to Jedi Knight later on. It's just a lot of fun to watch that journey, and then also to hit kids kind of with a dose of reality that sometimes not everything is all that it seems, and we're easily corruptible if left to our own devices or if left to our own hedonistic sort of ideology, whatever you want to call it. Maybe just thinking about Anakin turning to the dark side just to be able to save Padme, and it was all a farce anyway. Those themes really hit home for me, and they're really cool, and I think that they're existing outside of the Skywalker saga now, which is really cool. I think that there are characters that we can explore and come to know and love that aren't necessarily tied to Anakin or Luke or Leia or Han or any of the legacy characters that we're used to, because the world of Star Wars is vast, and the timeline of Star Wars is also vast. There's plenty to explore there, and there's plenty to love and appreciate. I'm not so sweaty as to have read all the novelizations or the extended universe stuff or even the comics and graphic novels, but I have watched, I think, all of the Star Wars media that exists now between Rebels, Clone Wars, and the films. I've seen all of that stuff, which I feel like gives me enough credence to say that I'm a fairly large Star Wars nut. What's interesting about the prequels is they had plenty of criticism back in the day, especially as they were coming out and even afterwards before Disney bought Star Wars. Fans were always polarized on those. People would say that they sucked, that they weren't good, that the acting was horrible, that the writing was horrible, all this sort of thing. And now that we have the sequels out and people have seen Disney's take on what the Star Wars franchise is, those are looked on more fondly now, which I'm very happy about. I think that it's well-deserved. I think that Ewan McGregor is a phenomenal Obi-Wan. I think that Hayden Christensen is a fantastic Anakin Skywalker. And I don't think that either of those guys got the credit that they deserved back in the day. And it's not just limited to them. Obviously, Natalie Portman as Padme Amidala was like so good. I have a soft spot for all of that just because, again, it's what I grew up with as a kid. It's the same reason that I have a soft spot for Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man. Those things are nostalgic in a way that things that are kind of nostalgia baity now can't ever replicate. And I think that what's cool as a Star Wars fan is Dave Filoni with Clone Wars and Rebels has been able to capture some of that Star Wars magic within those shows and within certain plot lines and giving more characterization to the characters that George brought to the screen in the early 2000s with the prequels. And then after the fact, characters that he created specifically from Clone Wars to be in Rebels and that sort of thing. And having just wrapped up Rebels, I can confidently say that it looks like Ahsoka is going to be a direct continuation of that in some sort of way. I think it's going to be cool. I think it's going to be really, really fun to watch. Rosario Dawson as Ahsoka has been fantastic so far in Mandalorian. We haven't gotten to see too much, which is also kind of nice. That way, when she gets into the show, we can really let her acting speak for itself and allow her to show us what that character looks like in live action and how she's evolved since Rebels and all that sort of stuff. I think it's going to be really cool. But then also getting to see characters like Sabine and Hera and Chopper and Thrawn. All that's going to be so much fun to see, and I'm really excited about it. But it got me thinking today, if this is the first show that I'm excited about that's Star Wars related in a really long time, it might be the same for a lot of other people. And just gauging on what I've seen online lately, I think I might be correct about that. And if that's the case, it got me thinking further. What could the implications of that be for, say, something like Galaxy's Edge? So on May 31st, 2019, Disney opened Galaxy's Edge in Disneyland, California. And on August 29th, the same year, Disney opened an identical park in Hollywood Studios in Disney World. Now, these parks offer a lot for Star Wars fans. You can ride the Millennium Falcon, or build a lightsaber from scratch, or go grab a drink at a cantina. Oh, and the park is also themed around the single most controversial trilogy maybe in film history. It's also self-existing within the 8th and 9th movie. And I think it's here where I take the most issue with Disney's branding for Galaxy's Edge. Instead of creating a land that celebrates Star Wars in its entirety, we're confined to this space between The Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker where we're short-sighted. All we have to go on is that Rey's around, Kylo's around, Chewie's around, but because we're confined at this point in time, the land doesn't feel a whole lot like Star Wars. If you're a fan of the sequels, and there's nothing wrong with being a fan of the sequels, people are 100% allowed to like what they like. I don't care for them. That doesn't mean that you have to also not care for them. I don't care. Like what you like. There are things to enjoy about in the sequels for sure. I actually really enjoy Kylo Ren as a character. But I think that the lack of legacy Star Wars in any regard inhibits the land from becoming what it really could be for Star Wars fans as a whole. And I think that this is where Disney's really missed the mark. The one really interesting thing, though, is Disney's actually already broken this canon planet that they've created called Batuu, where the story takes place. And they've broken it by introducing Mando and Grogu and Boba Fett and Fennec Shand to walking around in the park. Those characters obviously don't exist in the sequel trilogy, at least not in any meaningful capacity that we've seen. So what does any of this have to do with Ahsoka? Well, let me tell you. I think that if we're correct about Ahsoka sort of being a good restart for Disney Star Wars, culminating the events of Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett and all those sorts of things in this movie that they're gearing up towards later down the line, it makes a whole lot of sense to go ahead and do the same for Galaxy's Edge. And since they've already softly introduced these characters to the land as walkabout characters that you can meet and interact with, why not start retheming the land altogether? I think that it would make sense to make 3 different sections of Galaxy's Edge. And maybe you call it something different besides Galaxy's Edge too. What? I don't know. But you have a section dedicated to prequels, you have a section dedicated to original trilogy, and you have a section dedicated to sequel trilogy. And I think that in the in-betweens of those lands, you can have fun with it and include things from Rebels and Clone Wars. What would this buy Disney? Well, it would buy a lot of goodwill from Star Wars fans as a whole, and I think that that's a fan base that they've soured a lot lately. Some of the Star Wars fan base has been labeled as toxic and whatever else. Those things are all valid. There's definitely been just some way off the deep end crazies, but guess what? You're going to get that with any fan base. I think that you're seeing a more volatile reaction from Star Wars fans because there is a sense of just straight up disrespecting the legacy that George Lucas built with this franchise. And as I mentioned before, it's not that it's all bad. It's not. There were some good ideas there. I just think that they weren't implemented as well as they could have been. But if you have a prequel area of the park, guess what? That means that folks like me who grew up with the prequels that now have families are going to want to go and spend money to maybe interact with characters that they grew up with, like Obi-Wan and Anakin wearing Clone Wars armor, or even just their normal Jedi robes and seeing their blue lightsabers. And maybe you have a room dedicated to the Jedi Council and you get to see some of that stuff from Coruscant. Maybe in the original trilogy, you actually get to interact with a Luke Skywalker. Maybe it's not even a Return of the Jedi Luke Skywalker. Maybe it's like Cloud City Luke Skywalker or something like that from Empire Strikes Back. And of course, maybe you actually get to interact with Vader, which Vader can be interacted with at the launch bay within Hollywood Studios, I know, but it's not the same thing as just seeing him actually around in the Star Wars land. And since you already have Chewie, of course, include Chewie, but also include Han and Leia. How many people want to meet Han and Leia? Like everybody, anyone that's at the park that's going to see something that's Star Wars, they would probably like to see things that they grew up with. And yeah, of course, that's the generation that grew up with the original trilogy, but that leads me into the next bit, which is the sequel trilogy, which you've already done a good job establishing. Disney has hedged all their bets on everyone liking the sequel trilogy at least equally as much as they like either the prequels or the original trilogy. And guess what? They're delusional. That's just not the case. And that's okay. When something isn't working, you shouldn't double down on it. You should readjust. Ask the fans what they want, or at least read into what the fans are saying that they want online a little bit. You can't just bend the knee to everyone that has an opinion, of course. But there are valid concerns and things within Galaxy's Edge that I think could be improved. For starters, right now we only have 2 rides within Galaxy's Edge. You have Rise of the Resistance and you have Smuggler's Run, which is the Millennium Falcon ride. Both fine rides on their own merits, but the Millennium Falcon one you could easily just reskin to be something different, maybe something that actually involves Han Solo, maybe something where Luke and Leia are on the ship with you as well. There's some interesting ideas I think you could play with, especially since that ride's already in existence, but since it's virtual, that just takes some reimagining what that looks like, and we already know that they've done that with Star Tours, so you might as well. Rise of the Resistance, leave it alone. Leave it as part of the sequel trilogy, part of the park, for sure. It's a fun ride. It's a really fun ride, actually. But then for prequels, what do?
This is where the fun begins.
How about this, man? How about some pod racing? You know what I'm saying? Any of y'all remember that video game that they had at Chuck E. Cheese where you had the little thruster and you got to be in Anakin's pod, or maybe you got to pick your pod, I don't even remember. But you got to do pod racing, and it was this really cool, arcade game. But make it a pod racing attraction with Disney money, you know what I'm saying? Have that bad boy be moving. That's what I'm saying, Maybe Sebulba actually comes and knocks out one of your thrusters and you feel it, you spin out if you don't do something correctly or whatever. I don't know. You could have fun with it, but that would be really cool. Or even if it's not that, you could have something where it's like a different flying adventure or something. Maybe for the original trilogy, you get to be on Hoth during that whole interaction and you get to fly one of the snow speeders, or perhaps you're part of the Empire and you're walking in one of the AT-ATs as the rebellion is trying to crush you. There's so many ideas, there's so many different things that you could play with. I think Disney has just really been short-sighted with how they've been going about it. I think with Rise of the Resistance, they are actually on the right track, though. I think that that's Star Wars enough that people feel it because you're actually in an Imperial hangar bay to start off. There's all the stormtroopers out front. You get to see AT-ATs as you're going along. Kylo Ren's following you. Like, all of it does feel very Star Warsy. But Smuggler's Run, outside of the fact that you get to sit in the Millennium Falcon, everything that you're doing, none of it really makes sense. You're just running a errand for Hondo. I think that you can make that more interesting. I also think that like Oga's Cantina, which is cool in its own right, but why, when you have a cantina and you have such an iconic theme with the Cantina Band and the little aliens that play in the Cantina Band, would you not utilize that? Baffling to me. My guess, my assumption is the fact that we've already gotten Mando and Boba Fett in the park means that Ahsoka's probably on her way. And with Ahsoka, you can bridge a whole lot of gaps since she's existed across a lot of different timelines. And I know that all this might sound like a lot. Disney probably, in approach, was trying to keep things tight and concise, and they thought, we've got these 3 new movies, people are going to love them, it's going to be great, you know, all this stuff. It just hasn't shaken out that way. So now that it hasn't shaken out that way, you've got to adjust your plan. And as I mentioned before, they're already doing that. Look at Galactic Star Cruiser, which I haven't mentioned yet up to this point. But Galactic Star Cruiser, if you don't know about it, was a Star Wars hotel experience that you got to go in and stay for a couple nights, and it was like something crazy, like $5,000 on the cheapest end. And the whole thing just didn't even really feel like Star Wars. Like, you got to do some lightsaber training. The bedrooms that you were in were very consolidated. They didn't look super comfortable. The food was a little iffy for the price that you were paying. All these things add up, and when people don't see value there, they're not going to go. I take Galactic Star Cruiser and push that even beyond that hotel to the rest of Galaxy's Edge. It would be wise of Disney to give something Star Wars related to all fans of Star Wars. And you're not going to please everybody. There's always going to be things that people feel are missing, or there's always going to be things that people feel like could be done better. Whatever the case may be, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, as long as you're making a genuine effort on some level to represent all areas of Star Wars, you're going to be in good shape. With all that in mind, I'm very curious to hear what your thoughts are. Do you like Galaxy's Edge? Did you go on the Galactic Star Cruiser and enjoy it? Did you avoid both of them at all costs because you felt like they were overpriced and the reviews weren't awesome, so you just felt like you were going to stay away from it? Are you a sequel trilogy fan? Are you an original trilogy or prequel trilogy fan? Do you love it all? Do you only love some of it? I want to know what your thoughts are on Star Wars. I'm a big Star Wars nut. Let's talk about it. But that's all I've got for you today, guys. If you like this video, again, please click like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. May the Force be with you.